really have much prepared statements for this. I just wanted to make a small statement. We started thinking about this in January 2009. Over a discussion when Sandra was talking to me about the Elizabeth Bishop Centenary, we were thinking about things that were being done, and I thought, oh, maybe we could do something at ViewPoint, because she's talking about exhibits, painting and poetry readings and things, and I thought maybe a photography exhibit at ViewPoint would be really nice, and I didn't know where that would take it and what form it would be, and I thought, well, maybe eventually it came to responding to one of the poems, and it took a little while to decide which poem to come to, and after a lot of going through the poems, I came on one art as the poem to choose, because I found that that poem gave a lot of different points for visual entry, and because it wasn't a poem that gave me a specific picture. It was a poem that allowed for a lot of different interpretations, and so that is why I chose that poem. It was a very powerful poem, a very beautiful poem, and I really loved that poem. But it was also a poem that allowed for a lot of different visual interpretations. Question for Pete. Well, maybe should we start with statements from everybody that asked each of you to prepare a little short statement about your involvement in this exhibition, however you wanted to do that, whether your involvement as a jury member, your involvement as part of the Elizabeth Bishop Society, Sandra, and then Teresa and Monica, your involvement as exhibitors, and Sandy, if you wanted to say a few words.
Well, as you know, I'm very taciturn and shy, so I may not have anything to say.
Okay. And John, yes.
Well, I guess I'm thinking maybe Sandra could start in terms of describing a little more about the involvement of the society with the gallery and how all of this transpired.
Well, as Roxanne said, it was a conversation, and I think it sort of organically came out of just a general conversation. We've been thinking about the centenary for 5 or 6 years, lead up to it, and photography was something in Bishop's life that was very important to her. It's a complicated explanation of why, but just on the basic level of photographs in her life, her family was having photographs taken, from its early days, tin-type, daguerreotype photographs, right up to really crappy Polaroids from the 1970s. You can see that in her family documenting itself. And she always had a camera. She traveled a lot, right? So as a traveler, that was something that was part of the way she traveled, because she also loved looking at things. And with a camera, that's one way to look at things. And so there's a very well-known photograph of her in Brazil holding her little brownie camera being photographed by someone else. And when, I've been coming to exhibits here at ViewPoint for a while, and it just struck me that having photographers respond to Bishop would be a really interesting, wonderful thing, and quite appropriate. And the whole idea of the centenary was a multimedia, multidisciplinary kind of response to Bishop, her life and her art. And it was entirely Roxanne's choice to pick one art, which I thought was fascinating. There are so many concrete visual poems in Bishop that talk about something, and for her to choose a poem that really is about an existential state is quite interesting to me. And so I was thrilled when she chose that. I don't know, it's about a year later, I guess. And but I must commend Roxanne for the huge amount of creative force that she's put into this, and this exhibit, which is, to me, utterly fascinating. The completely different responses to this existential state that we all know so well. is kind of, I mean, it's actually quite indicative of Bishop herself, who is highly eclectic and interested in so many things. Roxanne talked about points of entry into the poem, visual, and that's kind of Bishop. There are many points of entry into Bishop. And so this is very much an embodiment of that kind of way of Bishop as an artist and as a person. And it's also quite marvelously multimedia. We've had John's film, we've had this sound installation. I mean, I just think it's embodied the spirit of what we've been hoping for with the whole centenary. So thank you, Roxanne. Thank you, everybody, for doing this amazing artwork. It's just wonderful. We have an installation happening.
Oh,
Oh, well, he's heard my spiel many times.
Is that
So.
better? Is that better? Good.
Yeah,
You've heard my spiel many times, John, so you
no,
didn't.
I'm sure I agree with all of it. The subject, perfect.
Well, from the point of view of the jury, it's interesting the way that you described the process, because it was very much the same process on the jury. It was odd, just so that you're aware of who I was. My name is Bob Barrio. I'm a photographer here at ViewPoint. I've been involved in the visual arts for 30 years now. The other members of the jury were Adriana Afford, who has a gallery here, and Anne Simpson, who's quite a well-known Canadian poet. When we got together as a jury to look at the work, what we found ourselves with was kind of with an absence of criteria, if anything else. So it seemed that the only criteria we had was our own response to the poem itself. So it was kind of an odd situation to be in, where we were using our own response as the criteria to evaluate other artists' response. And it was sort of it created sort of an open situation where it would open the jury to different interpretations of how it's seen it. Now, obviously, we came with baggage, and we all, as members of the jury, relied on that baggage to bring information. For me, one of the big things, and I remember at the opening you asking me how familiar I was with Elizabeth Bishop, and I guess my best response was to say, I'm not that familiar with Elizabeth Bishop, but I'm familiar with the Villanelle as a poem, because we all know Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle Into This Good Night, and then Sylvia Plath wrote a whole bunch of villanelles. And I just found that poetic structure was a good entry point. And we started talking a little bit about that on the jury, because the villanelle, we often talk about photography as being in a poetic state, where it's a very brief statement where you try and encapsulate a lot of experience and try to express it through a very, very momentary gesture. So it has a lot of commonality with a poem like that. And the nice thing about the villanelle was that it was, in poetic terms, a very structured form in dealing with what can be sometimes very chaotic content. So there was a nice, seemed to be a very nice comparison in terms of the state of poetry and the state of photography. And that sort of was at least a starting point for the jury to start talking about what are we looking for here. And having Anne Simpson sort of like looking at the photographs with a poet's eye helped out the same way. Adriana had a very instinctive eye in terms of her experience in dealing with art, between always being sort of stuck as a dealer between audience and the expression of the artist, and trying to find, like, it seemed to be more about trying to find some sense of clear communication in the same way as poetic structure could bring in clear communication. And so the discussion became very, very interesting, very animated very quickly. What helped us was just the quality of the work. And all of a sudden we had some very, very strong work to look at, so that most of the work we were looking at was very interesting on some level with regard to the discussion. So it became very clear that we could easily put an exhibition together, but then we just sort of followed a process of saying, okay, well, what's the best of the best of the best here? And it became sort of a very pleasurable experience of taking each body of work and being able to define some things that sort of answered to those criteria. But again, it seemed we came out at the other end of the jury knowing more about the criteria than when we went in. And so it was, again, it comes back to that whole idea of how photography can enter that sort of poetic state. So it became a great conversation. The other thing we watched out, of course, was the whole idea of, yes, Elizabeth Bishop lived in Nova Scotia for a time. And we even discussed that whole idea of cultural appropriation on a different level, in the sense that we take the convenience of that history and we try to spin a story. Oh, she was into photography, which, you know, her level of involvement in photography was probably equal to anyone's involvement in photography on a certain level. There was an interest there, but not so much that we would have had to address it as being sort of a professional interest in photography.
No, yeah. But she was interested in photography as she was interested in painting, and she did both of those things. And she would never call herself photographer or painter.
Yeah.
But the interest, Bishop's interest in things is not your average interest.
Yeah. Yeah, but that was just, I'm just pointing to that as being, that would have been an open door to a discussion which would probably made the jury go for 3 more days.
Right.
So we sort of
Right.
steered away from that as being too large an issue, and say it's great, it's a nice connection. So I mean, that's sort of, you know, I guess, you know, it's hard for me to speak on behalf of the other members of the jury, but that's sort of a nutshell of the kinds of things that went on.
And the idea, you talk about the lack of criteria, but the idea, part of the idea around the whole centenary is this idea of creating new work, not you know, appropriating Bishop or, you know, being appropriated by her or anything like that, but actually the response idea.
Yeah.
And so that you actually do enter your own, somehow in a way that's inspired by, well, essentially one word in that poem, which is loss, right? Losing, loss. And so the idea, you know, the lack of criteria probably was quite appropriate, because, you know, it allowed you then to sort of walk through that relationship, which was very clever, Roxanne. Maybe not intentional, but very clever. So,
Yeah. Where that discussion came up, the whole idea of loss was that whole sense of, the word that came up was evocation, evocation and emotion, where photography can do the same thing. It's an example where you have just a collective body of items that come together and yet create, rather than a literal object, but an evocation of feeling. And that, again, those commonalities between poetry and photography. And that came up in a large way.
So John, did you want to speak about your piece?
I'm trying to get better at reading lips. I did catch some of the nuance, but definitely not every word. Did you want me to say anything, or?
Yes, did you want to speak about your work?
Okay, sure. Sort of weird for me to jump in when I haven't gotten necessarily exactly every word of what anybody has said. So we'll just go ahead with it anyway. I mean, I think for me the interesting problem with One Art, I did 2 adaptations of the poems of Elizabeth Bishop poems. One was Sandpiper, and one was One Art. And I found with One Art, it was really a puzzle how to make the images work with the sounds, because so much it's important, I think, for the visual work to leave open a lot of room for people's imagination. And I think if, for example, if you showed lost door keys or the houses that were dear to Elizabeth Bishop, that wouldn't do justice to the poem. There's a need to kind of find images that created a sense of, well, I guess what I was going for was a sense of transition, or where things were changing. in the frame, and that's why I use time lapse a lot, to give that sense of I don't know, the feeling of loss without necessarily pointing to something directly like door keys or houses or her mother's watch or something. I think if I put images like that on, it would have done a disservice to the poem. There was a real need, I think, to stay away from literal and to try to keep it more like almost like if you think of a four-piece rock band, like what the bass does in a band. It sort of grounds the poem in something, but doesn't try to lead it explicitly. The melody is already doing that, and so the images, I think, are more designed to continue to lead, to give room for the melody to work, I guess, or to maybe accentuate it in places.
Thank you.
Which one is his? Is his
The video.
oh, the video?
Which is off right now. Oh, there it is.
No,
There.
it's just
Oh,
between
good.
frames.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that time lapse. I love time lapse.
They just, they're remarking how much they enjoy your work, John.
Oh, thank you so much.
Very cleverly done, and the time lapse, it's just to see something alive and then to see it fading away, it's really pretty neat the way you captured that. Even in the shadows, the sort of the life and vibrancy, and then to see it fading is pretty neat. I think you did a great job.
Thank you. I got most of that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Oh, actually, it's suddenly getting much better.
Maybe it's the way,
The sound.
one of the things that I think is marvelous about the film, John, is your use of light and shadow, which to me kind of helps to represent that sort of state of being non-literally, and yet somehow we're all drawn, and the passage of time, which is really an underlying aspect of loss and losing and whatnot, which I also find evident in just about every image here. The kind of a moment in time, it is captured, but there's something about showing about the passage of
The
time.
passage of time and the way it has sort of taken something away
Yeah.
from the vibrancy of life
Yeah.
and sucked it out.
And you do, and I mean, one of the ways I think John does that is with shadow and light and the moving of that across the screen, and because you are responding to that quite emotionally when you see it, visually as well. You're registering that, but what it's telling you is really about the passing of time. And I mean that the tree that you got. I mean, you spent a lot of time doing that tree, right? Did you hear that, John?
How long did it take you to do the tree?
To do the what?
Tree,
The freeze?
tree,
The
T-R.
tree. Oh, the tree, thank you. Yeah, I actually set up a trash can in my backyard with a plexiglass plate over the top of it and put the camera inside for about 5 or 6 months.
Oh my
And
God.
just took, I let it go. I had to go in and replace the battery every 3 or 4 days. Yeah, that was the first time I'd ever tried something like that. It was, my neighbor thought I was crazy. She was certain that the camera would get stolen. But it occurred to me that nobody would suspect that a camera would be inside a garbage can underneath plexiglass in a tree. So, that was, I felt like I had sort of conventional wisdom on my side.
Actually, you should have had a separate camera filming people looking into the trash can. Oh, what's that?
Well, yeah, that's
another film.
That's what I'll do. Yeah,
That's
I
not
thought actually about having a couple of cameras there, but maybe next time. Because I think it would be interesting to get the loss of the leaves from a few different perspectives. But this was, like I said, an initial experiment, so I just wanted to try it with one to start.
nicely done.
But I think that's and that, again, that sense of tree losing leaves, it's not a real explicit, I mean, I think it's something that everybody can relate to, and that was sort of the concept, was to stick with the theme of loss and try to develop certain themes of loss within the visuals that hopefully complemented the words but didn't take away from the rhythm or the melody of the work.
You know, John, you just said something that I think is interesting in the poem and in your images, loss of these sort of ordinary objects and ordinary things. And like you said, everyone's seen the trees fall off the tree. We've all experienced this sense of loss, and sometimes it's the most ordinary, simple things that can trigger the memory of a greater loss or a deeper loss. And sometimes those little things are just as traumatic in some ways. So to choose something that, you know, good you didn't do the literal interpretation, but to choose something that is still something that everybody can identify with, I thought was very clever.
I think that was part of what I was trying to do. Thank you for noticing that.
You're very welcome. Roxanne,
Do you want to speak about your work?
do I want to say, okay, sure. Well, when I first got involved with this project, my life was quite different, and I had no idea what was coming down the road. I sent a number of different images in, and this was, to the jury, this was probably the last one that I expected to be chosen.
Which one is it?
It's this one here. Which, as it turns out, of course, in turn of events, is probably the most appropriate one. So there's a little bit of irony in that, I suppose. My partner passed away in March, and just this March, and so things, the feeling and the sense of loss, the understanding of that, the understanding how big things, little things are connected, losing those things, it's very different than it was when I first became involved with this project. So understanding loss, and also having had a few insights and revelations since that time. I might get emotional. Just the other night, I got this sense that the energy continues and that it's actually living on in the bodies and the cell structure and the minds of, like, physically living on, not just as a memory, but living on in the people who loved him. I knew I should have held that box of Kleenex closer to me. Go get it. Anyways, it's just something that we all will, if we haven't experienced yet, we will eventually experience, and I think it was just very fortuitous for me to become involved with this project and this poem, Elizabeth Bishop, and in some ways it's really kind of helped me deal with some of it. Yeah, it has. So this image, I had called it What Might Have Been, and I called it that again before Mark passed away, because I submitted that before we knew any of this, right? So it was just kind of a crazy coincidence. But what might have been, when I titled it that, it was just the sadness in her eyes, the look, the redness in her eyes, and this is a mannequin, the face of the mannequin. I actually have the whole thing, but I cropped it to that size. And there's just this longing and sorrow and sort of the red color as if she's been crying and missing something and wishing for something. And when I called it What Might Have Been, it's sort of like, if only life had been different, what might have been? And that was my intent in the title. So now I have a different sense of it.
Right.
Anyways, I think that's better.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Lost something else, my name tag. Oh, that doesn't mean so.
No.
Who am I?
Crisis of identity.
Yes.
Okay.
Got my name back.
Teresa, do you want to speak about your piece?
Yes, you'll have to forgive me if I babble. This is my first experience. I found out
And
about
which
this
is yours?
exhibit. Oh, the person disappearing in the snow.
Oh, beautiful.
Right over there. I found out about this exhibit through an artist friend of mine who sent me an email. And so she said, you should submit, she has always been after me to do something with my work as opposed to just keeping it on my computer. And I have to say, my first response was, well, it might be interesting. And then I saw the link to Elizabeth Bishop, and the name was familiar, but I couldn't quite remember where I had heard it. And so then I, of course, have to do research because that's the kind of person I am. And so I went looking and I read the poem and I thought, well, this makes a lot of sense. And I think, and this is what I wrote in my blurb, or my artist statement, sorry, when I send it off, is that we do lose things every day, but just to say something is lost seems so empty, because really it continues to shape us in some way, whatever it is, whether it's a really significant loss, or even the items we forgot we lost. And just recently I was moving house, and as we're packing and trying to divest ourselves of some of our stuff, I came across all these things that I forgot we had. Things like, you know, the guest book to our wedding, right? And I sat and went through that, and oh yeah, they were there. I'm babbling, so I'm sorry. But it just was interesting because, and so that's why I wrote about it being echoes, because whatever it was that we lost is not in our life, but it's still in our life as an echo of some sort. And then eventually we're all going to become echoes. Now about the photo that I took, as you can see, it was a snowy day. It's a trail close to where I was living at the time, out down in Bridgewater. And I was walking my dogs. And I always have my camera, because whenever I don't, I regret it. And I was taking a picture of something else, and I looked down at that spot where all the trees form a tunnel, which has fascinated me on a number of occasions. And there was a person, and they were walking towards us, and then I think they saw my dogs, and they turned around and they were walking away. And it was one of those moments when you see the photo in its totality, right? It's not a posed photo. I have no idea who that human being is. But I had about 10 seconds or less to get that shot, right? So I'm quickly rummaging with my camera, and I think I got off 3 shots before he disappeared, right? And was gone, and then it's like, well, I hope that worked. Because there's a lot of times you see a photo and it's going to go really fast, and then you go back home and you look at it and go, oh, darn, I missed it. But that one worked. So there's actually very little editing to that photo other than a crop and a conversion to black and white, which made total sense because there was very little color that day because of the snow. And I've had a lot of interesting responses to that photos from friends, and they all are seeing something different in it. And I think loss is something that we all feel differently. So that was one of the items I put in. Sorry, I didn't sound too.
Wonderful, not at all. Thank you.
My daughter is here, by the way, for moral support. I dragged her along.
She helped with the
And
Skype.
she's the Skype support, yeah.
Volume support. Yeah. I'm just hoping a bit.
I see you're looking at me.
No, just,
Okay, you're looking at Roxanne, who's next to me. Okay, good.
Marla, did you want to say something about your piece?
Sure. It's the piece over here, taken in an abandoned building. Actually, the morning of 9/11, 10 years ago today.
Really? Really?
And it was a day when I guess I was feeling personal loss before all of that happened. I was in Cape Breton on a vacation by myself and just heading home. And was just coming out of a pretty important relationship in my life that hadn't worked out. So when I read this poem, one art, it I definitely sort of feel like I can relate to the tail end of the poem. And I guess, well, basically what happened was I was driving home. I had packed up my car. I was heading back to Halifax, and I heard the news from New York on the car radio. And it was actually the first time in 3 weeks I had consumed any media whatsoever. I was working at the Daily News at the time as a journalist, and for me, vacation meant really shutting all of that out and escaping from the world for a little while, because it can really consume your life. But for some reason that morning, I just felt like I needed to reconnect and see what was going on with the planet, and boom, that's what was happening. And it was almost too much. I mean, I couldn't keep driving. I had to stop the car and really absorb what was happening. And stopped in a driveway in a house that was for sale, and it had kind of intrigued me a few times that week, driving past this for sale sign. So I drove in a very long driveway and then realized the house was abandoned. It looked like it had been empty for quite some time. And so I just kind of sat in the car a little bit longer, listening to more of the news, and got to a point where I couldn't listen, I guess. It was just too much, and I was out of cell phone range. I wasn't able to call anyone or talk about it with anyone. So I went and I was poking around the yard of this house, and noticed the door was ajar. So walked into the house to have a look, and noticed that it just seemed that whoever had lived there left in a big hurry. There were toys strewn all over the place. There were clothes still sort of half packed in a suitcase on the bed, dirty dishes in the sink, and you know, it got me wondering, like, what happened here that made the occupants leave so quickly. And I got sort of wrapped up in this mystery of this mysterious empty house, and took photographs in quite a few of the rooms. I brought some of the other ones with me if any of you would like to have a look at them. But I guess this one image in particular is maybe the most haunting. It almost looks as though the refrigerator's a coffin. But I guess the thing that really struck me going through this house was there was kind of an element of cheerfulness as well that you hear in the poem too. You know, most of the rooms were colored these brilliant shades of pink and yellow and orange, and even though everything was kind of falling apart, the house just still felt kind of cheerful, like happy lives had been led there. So when I actually found out a call for submissions from a friend of mine who runs the Great Village Antique Store right beside Elizabeth Bishop's house, and I had long been a fan of Elizabeth Bishop's.
Grant or Minor?
Grant, yeah. And he suggested that I submit something, and so I kind of thought about it, and I suppose that's always been one of my favorite poems of hers, and so I just thought that the theme sort of fit. I mean, in terms of the collective loss of that particular morning, that day, that maybe it's taken us 10 years to really fully realize the impact of the loss for us here. I mean, especially in New York, but in North America as well. My generation, at least, I mean, we've always had war in our lives, I guess, but never sort of on our own soil in North America, and that really brought war to home for us here in North America. And I guess there's been kind of a loss of innocence, and obviously loss of great many lives. And anyway, that's kind of where I was that day, and the process of being in that house taking photographs for me was kind of a coping mechanism and a way of communicating, and kind of like writing poetry must have been for Elizabeth, I guess. And I guess I appreciated the humor, even though she was writing about a subject that could be quite sad. It was also very humorous, and it had its light side as well, I guess.
Thank you. Roxanne.
I suppose I should talk about mine. Do you want me to hold this one?
Sure. I'll just say a few words about mine. Oops, my turn. I have, because I've been thinking about this exhibition for a while, I've been thinking about what am I going to do for this show? Because would have liked to submit a few works and see if my work gets selected by the jury. And so thought about it, and I thought about the obvious, you know, the lost watch and photographing somebody walking away from lost keys. And no, it just wasn't working. And I remember last About a year or so ago, I saw this poster for a lost pet and on a pole, and the photo of the cat had been water damaged and it had faded away to nothing. And I didn't get back to photograph it, but I started getting really interested in these pet posters, and I started photographing them. And I didn't know what I was doing with them, and then I realized I'm working on my submission. And this is what came out of it. That poor cat had been doubly lost, but I was interested in the format. I put them all in a stack because that is usually how those photos are found, on a pole. And so I put them on a pole. I put the text, which is a paraphrase, but not specifically what is found on some of the posters. It isn't exactly what they say, but it gives the spirit of what they say. And in one case, it's actually the opposite. I say the pet is usually friendly. But the poster actually says the pet is actually unfriendly.
How are they going to identify it then? How will they identify it then if it's found?
There's all different ways people use, but there's these little GPS chips that they put in your ears. I know. But most of those are in California. One of them's in Cape Breton.
I think that you should print that up and continue that and stick them all over town. Like a lost unicorn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was it you that?
I told you about the lost unicorn.
I really responded to that one, I think, to a large degree because you underline the lines, the essence that you pull from each of the pieces. To me, it was very poetic. It was like the essence of what their loss was about.
Yeah.
And so to me, the poetry was there as well as the
Does anybody have any specific questions?
What about Sandy?
Oh, Sandy.
Oh, that's all right.
Get up here.
What's that?
Get your butt up here.
Get it up here?
Get it up here.
I feel like one of the lost boys in Peter Pan. Would advance backwards.
That's just where that is. Go sit on
Okay.
Elizabeth's
All
lap.
right, do I have, okay.
You're right there. Sit on
On there, all right. Excuse me. I'm Sandy Mine, and I'm glad that there were so many participants in this, thanks to the jury, participants in this exhibition from outside ViewPoint. I had thought a lot more viewpointers would have been involved, and in fact, there were just 3 of us whose work was selected, and I think there were only 3 of us who actually submitted. I guess they didn't dare believe anything, so anyway, it is very nice that there are many other people who participated, because that's the sort of thing that ViewPoint endeavors to do more and more to reach out to the larger community of photographers and the larger community in general. My image is one called The Continent, and it, unlike I think everything else, is the really only literal photograph, any only literal representation of one of the words in two of the words in one art. In my own defense, I will say it seems very prosaic in relation to some of the other things that people have said, particularly the story. Well, Monica's very personal reminiscences, and Marla's story about 10/11, exactly 10 years ago today.
Wow,
I mean, it is an amazing thing.
Yeah.
But as I said, mine's pretty prosaic in relation to all of those. But in my own defense, I will say that it was only one of 5 images I submitted, and as Monica said about hers, it was the one I least expected to be chosen. But the others were, somebody referred to, maybe Sandra, to the fact that there were, or maybe it was Roxanne, not to be so focused on the on some attribute that related directly to the visitor.
It was John here.
Oh, all right, sorry, John. You said something about not, John hasn't moved for a while, is he still there?
He's listening.
Okay, his eyes are moving.
Trying to visit.
Sorry.
Sorry for the lack of microphone.
No. Several of my images did relate specifically to the Bishop place, the sort of heart of Elizabeth Bishop in Nova Scotia, the Elizabeth Bishop House, now so-called, in Great Village. But the reference in those pictures was, as Monica has said, partly to the idea that some aspect of a personality and a physical presence that is mostly been lost still remains in an area, because there's a theory that on a molecular or atomic level, these tiny little particles are so numerous that I'm almost unable to comprehend it, that it's hard to understand how small they are and how prevalent they are, how ubiquitous and omnipresent they are, because they're sort of everywhere. So the concept is that, some of Elizabeth Bishop's atoms may still be swirling around on the ground and be, in the crooks of trees and so forth in the Great Village, and perhaps in every other place, everywhere in the world. And it's kind of a comforting thought that, and this is what Monica was talking about, we retain, there's some semblance of some people retain, not just in memory, which is probably the most important way that we preserve our people who we've loved and lost, but also in actual physical sense, though not in any particularly comforting sense, except sort of, again, existentially. It's not, it's probably not very comforting to think about a tiny little atom from which you can derive very little, but you can at least derive the sense that they're still involved. Anyway, somebody said, and I think it was Teresa, that she had rambled on, and I'm giving her a lesson now. But to go back to the image that was chosen, a continent, it isn't even the continent, which we all know was the one referred to by Bishop, that being South America, but it's in fact Europe, but it's probably, depending on exactly where I don't have a GPS on my little camera, so I don't know whether it was Italy, Switzerland, or France at that particular moment, but it's somewhere over the Alps anyway, just north of Italy, and because Bishop did have a sense of longing and, I suppose to some sense, and therefore loss about Italy, a place she visited a couple of times, but to which she had meant many times to return and was always thwarted in her attempt. So it seemed to me that at least bore some relevance. And so that is all I have to say. I'd like to end it on a more eloquent note, but I'm afraid that's all I have.
I have something to say.
All right.
I want to say that in your reference to the atoms swirling about
Oh, yeah.
and all of that, that's not a comforting concept. I actually got immense comfort from that idea that there is still a physical presence.
Yeah, well, that's right, yeah.
And not just in my brain.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Whether it's true or not, the idea that, oh my God, those words that just came out of my mouth as I was laying in bed trying to get to sleep, they didn't come from my brain, they came from something else. Those were his words. So that physical swirling around of atoms, that's very comforting. It means that it hasn't just poof disappeared.
Yeah, no, No, and if true, then this augmentation of memory with a physical presence, however tiny,
Yes.
is it is an augmentation, and therefore it builds the sense of the person being with us.
It finally gave me the explanation how pyramids got built in Egypt and South America at the same time without there being communication between the two, this universal consciousness. It kind of went like, oh, that's how it was done. You know, I may change my mind again tomorrow, but for the moment, it was kind of like, oh, I get it now. There's a mystery, but isn't so much a mystery. So it did give comfort.
Yeah. Well,
Lost
thank you.
and found.
Yes, yes. If I can say something else, and it has nothing to do with my work or anybody's work specifically, it has more to do with the knowledge, the increasing awareness of Elizabeth Bishop as a person and as a poet, and of her importance in both ways. I don't know how many other people this is true, but I'd never heard of Elizabeth Bishop until this year. And so Sandra and John and Roxanne and everybody who's involved have my thanks for making me aware of her. But you know, I went to Acadia in the 1960s, Annapolis Valley. I wasn't an English student, but I took some English courses, and Ernest Buckler, who nobody knew about Ernest Buckler. Well, maybe in those days some people did know. Well, obviously people knew, but,
Yes,
it wasn't being taught, as far as I know. He wasn't being taught, and certainly Elizabeth Bishop was not, as far as I know. So we are all indebted to those of you who founded, members of the society, and the people who made this year-long celebration, or at least 9-month-long celebration of her and her work. We're indebted to you for making us all aware that she lived and wrote and had her being.
That seems like a good way to end.
Can I just make a plug for something coming up?
Sure.
For everybody here. We're having our, essentially a kind of closing celebration for the centenary. It has to end at some point. We're having an event in Great Village, Truro and Great Village, the end of September, early October. The anniversary of her death is the 6th of October, so we timed this to be approximate to that. And it's a 3-day event. I do have information about it here if you're interested. On the 30th of September, the poet naturalist Harry Thurston is giving a talk in Truro at the Nova Scotia Agricultural College about the Bay of Fundy. Will be fabulous. It's a free event in the evening. On Saturday, the 1st of October, we're recreating what we call the Moose route. She has a poem called The Moose, which runs along Highway 2 up from Great Village to Parsboro. And we're getting on a bus, which she did in The Moose, in the poem, and we're recreating that. And it's a guided tour with Harry. It's a day long. We're going up as far as Advocate Harbor and coming back down. I think it will be fabulous. And then on Sunday, the 2nd of October, we're having a gala concert in the afternoon in Great Village, which is going to be really quite wonderful. Suzy LeBlanc, Blue Engine String Quartet, John Plant, Jocelyn Fleury, and they're all going to be performing, singing new settings of Bishop poems, other wonderful music, and we're also premiering, John, you'll be interested in this, we're premiering a music video that's been done by Pink Dog Productions, based on Sandpiper. So that's coming up. It will kind of close out the year of celebrations. There will be things occurring afterwards, but this is the last really big event. So if anybody's interested, I've got some information about it. And
You'll put all that in the post.
yeah, it's going out to the media, but also if you go to the Elizabeth Bishop Society website, elizabethbishopns.org, there's a whole page that lists everything there about the final weekend. And I think it's a way to reflect on all the incredible creativity that's happened this year in response to Bishop. And so it's again multimedia, and like this wonderful exhibition, it really is many layered and hopefully will be as provocative as this has been. I think I've been hearing from people that they've been coming to the gallery and seeing. I had 2 emails this morning about that from people and how fascinated they are by the images. And one of the things I do want to mention is I think your artist statements are fascinating. This is the kind of exhibition that it does help to have that text and sort of a sense of the context. And I just found them all, and the stories today, all incredibly powerful. And so it's really quite lovely to have the background to that. I think you've done really wonderful artist statements as well as amazing photography and artwork. So just wanted to say that.
I just want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank ViewPoint Gallery. I want to thank our sponsors, the Elizabeth Bishop Society and the Carbon Arc Society for sponsoring our events.
Well, I know that the Bishop Society has never done anything with ViewPoint. I mean, been coming here for some years, but it's this one of the nice things, one of the wonderful things about the centenary for the Bishop Societies. It's helped us to reach out to other community groups and other artists, and that's enriched the society tremendously. And so we're very, very grateful to ViewPoint, to Roxanne, but to everyone here to be being open to this. It's just really wonderful. So thank you. And thanks, John, for coming all the way.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Do you want me to take you on a tour of the show, John?
Yes, yeah, you could do that, yeah, but I'm sure that, is everything finished?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, let's see it.
Okay. I'll take the cord off.